The year was 1943, and Sergeant James Washington stood guard outside Camp Aliceville in Alabama, watching German prisoners of war march past him in orderly rows. They wore clean uniforms with the letters PW stenciled on their backs. They smiled, some even waved. Jim didn't wave back. How could he? These men, enemy soldiers who had fought to conquer the world, were about to walk into a town diner, where Jim himself would be turned away at the door. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was fighting for American freedom, while Germans, actual Nazis, had more freedom on American soil than he did. Camp Aliceville was one of hundreds of POW camps scattered across the United States during World War II. By the war's end, America would hold over 400,000 German prisoners. They worked on farms and factories, did labor that kept the country running while American men fought overseas. But what most people don't know is the strange, uncomfortable truth about how these camps operated, especially in the segregated South. What happened there would challenge everything these prisoners believed about America, about race, and about humanity itself. Jim Washington had enlisted in 1942, right after Pearl Harbor. He was 24 years old, strong, smart, had finished high school when most black kids in Mississippi couldn't. He believed, or wanted to believe, that serving his country might change things. Maybe if he wore the uniform, if he proved himself, things would be different when his mama had cried when he left, not from pride but from fear. She knew the world wasn't ready to see her son as equal, uniform or not. His father, a sharecropper who'd spent his life working land he'd never owned, had shaken his hand and said nothing. What was there to say? The first shot came during basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia. Separate barracks, separate mess halls, separate everything. The white soldiers trained for combat roles, learning tactics and strategy. Jim and the other black soldiers trained to be laborers, cooks, guards, support personnel. They weren't trusted with the glory of battle. They were trusted to clean up after it, to serve, to stay in their place even in uniform. The white officers barely looked at them. When they did, it was with contempt or indifference, never respect. When Jim got his assignment to guard German POWs at Camp Aliceville, he felt the bitter weight of it. He was good enough to watch over enemy soldiers, but not good enough to fight beside his fellow Americans. Good enough to hold a gun over Nazis, but not good enough to eat in the same dining hall as white soldiers. The assignment felt like an insult, but Jim reported for duty. What else was he going to do? He'd do his job, do it well. Not for the Army, not for America, but for himself, for his own dignity. Camp Aliceville sat on about 400 acres of red Alabama clay, surrounded by pine forests and cotton fields. Barbed wire fences stretched for miles, glinting in the southern sun. Guard towers stood at every corner, manned 24 hours a day. Inside lived 6,000 German prisoners, mostly captured in North Africa during the campaigns of 1942 and 43. They were Rommel's Afrika Korps, tough soldiers who had expected to die in the desert. Instead, they found themselves in rural Alabama, eating 3 hot meals a day, sleeping in heated barracks, playing soccer on makeshift fields. Oberleutnant Franz Becker had commanded a panzer unit in Tunisia before his capture in May of 1943. He was 38 years old, a career military man from Prussia, raised on discipline and duty. When the British captured him and the Americans shipped him across the Atlantic, he expected the worst. Propaganda back home had painted Americans as brutal, cruel to prisoners. But nothing prepared him for what he actually found. The voyage across the Atlantic had been rough. Hundreds of German prisoners packed in the hold, seasick, scared, uncertain of their fate. Rumors spread that they'd be executed or used as slave labor. But when they arrived in America and were transported to Alabama, the reality was shockingly different. The food was good, regular, and filling. 3 meals a day with bread, meat, vegetables. The barracks were clean, with real beds and blankets. They had medical care. They could send letters home through the Red Cross, receive packages. They even got paid for their work, 80 cents a day in scrip they could spend at the camp canteen on cigarettes, candy, soap, writing paper. Franz couldn't understand it. This wasn't how you treated enemies. The Geneva Convention, the Americans explained. All prisoners must be treated humanely, given adequate food and shelter, allowed to work for pay, permitted to maintain their dignity. Franz had heard of the Geneva Convention, but he never expected anyone to actually follow it. War was war. You crushed your enemies. That's what he'd been taught. What confused Franz even more were the black guards. He'd never seen black soldiers before, never imagined they existed. The propaganda had told him Americans were weak, divided, that mixing races had weakened them. But these black soldiers carried themselves with quiet dignity and professional bearing. They were disciplined, sharp in their uniforms, competent with their weapons. They knew their duties and executed them flawlessly. Some were better soldiers than men Franz had commanded in the Wehrmacht, yet the white Americans treated these black soldiers terribly. Franz watched as white officers barked orders at black sergeants, who clearly had more experience. He saw black guards eating separately, using different facilities. He saw them forbidden from entering the same buildings the German prisoners could freely access. When German prisoners went into town on work details, they could enter stores, restaurants, public buildings that their black guards could not. It made no sense to Franz. Private Heinrich Müller was only 19 when he arrived at Aliceville in the summer of 1943. He'd been in the Hitler Youth since he was 10 years old, believing everything about Aryan supremacy and the master race. His older brother had died on the Eastern Front, and Heinrich had volunteered immediately, eager to avenge him. He'd served in North Africa for only 3 months before his unit surrendered. The shame of it burned in him. He expected American prison camps to be hellholes. His first week at Aliceville shattered that expectation. The guards treated them firmly but fairly. The food was better than what he'd eaten in the field. He had a bed, a roof, safety. It was almost comfortable, which made him feel guilty. His brother had died fighting. Heinrich was living in relative peace. Then came the work details. Groups of prisoners were taken to nearby farms to work. One day, after working all morning in the fields, the guards took Heinrich's group into the town of Aliceville for lunch. The white guard went inside the local diner first, spoke to the owner, then came back out and waved them in. Heinrich couldn't believe it. They sat at tables with checkered cloths, were served hot coffee, thick sandwiches, slices of apple pie, real American pie. As they were leaving, Heinrich saw Sergeant Washington outside, leaning against the truck. He was eating something from a paper bag. Heinrich asked the guard why the sergeant didn't eat inside. The guard looked uncomfortable, mumbled something about local customs, but a local farmer said it plain. Colorades aren't allowed inside. That's just how it is. Heinrich stood there on the sidewalk full of apple pie and felt something crack in his worldview. He was a German prisoner, a Nazi soldier, and he could eat where an American soldier, a black American soldier, could not. The contradiction was stunning. If Americans believed in racial superiority, why were they treating him, the enemy, better than their own? If black people were inferior, as he'd been taught, why were they trusted with weapons and authority? Nothing made sense anymore. Corporal David Robinson, known as Doc to everyone in the camp, had seen it all before. He'd grown up in rural Georgia, son of a Baptist preacher, knew the rules of Jim Crow. He'd learned early to keep his head down, say yes sir and no ma'am, never look a white man directly in the eye. But he'd also learned he was smart, good with his hands, good at understanding how things worked. When he got sick as a child, the black doctor who treated him became his hero. Doc Turner had dignity and skill. Young David decided that's what he wanted to be. The Army was happy to have black medics for treating other black soldiers. David went through medical training, learned anatomy and first aid, how to treat wounds and illnesses. He was good at it, had steady hands and a calm demeanor that put patients at ease. When he arrived at Camp Aliceville, he was assigned to the camp infirmary to treat everyone. German prisoners, white guards, black guards, didn't matter. Medical care was medical care. The Germans respected Doc immediately. They saw how skilled he was, how he worked with precision and care. He treated them the same as anyone else, with professional detachment, but also with kindness. When they were in pain, he eased it. When they were scared, he reassured them. Some of the prisoners had never been treated by someone not white before. Doc's competence challenged their assumptions. He spoke some German, had learned it in high school. The prisoners appreciated that he tried to communicate in their language. Doc became the moral center of the camp in ways he never intended. People came to him, not just for medical care, but for perspective, for understanding. He had a way of seeing people clearly without hatred or ideology. He'd patch up a German injured in a work accident with the same care he'd give anyone. Then he'd turn around and tend to a black guard beaten by white townspeople on his day off, treating those wounds with the same steady hands, the same gentle voice. When Johann Schneider got sick in November of 1943, Doc was the one who treated him. Johann was 20 years old, from a small village in Bavaria, had been a farmer before the war. He'd been feeling poorly for days, coughing, feverish, but trying to hide it. By the time he reported to the infirmary, his condition was serious. Pneumonia, Doc diagnosed. Both lungs were infected. Doc sat with Johann for 3 nights straight, monitoring his condition, trying everything he could. Cool compresses for the fever, steam to help him breathe, fluids to keep him hydrated. He talked to Johann softly in German, told him to keep fighting. Johann was scared, homesick, wanted his mother. Doc held his hand, wiped his forehead, stayed beside him. The other German prisoners watched this, saw how much care Doc gave to one of their own. But Johann's lungs continued to fill with fluid. His breathing became labored, then desperate. On the 4th night, with Doc beside him, Johann Schneider died. Doc closed the boy's eyes, pulled the sheet over his face, and felt the familiar weight of loss. Enemy or not, a boy was still just a boy. 20 years old, should have had his whole life ahead of him. Doc said a prayer his father had taught him, then went to inform Captain Harris and Franz Becker. What happened next would change everything at Camp Aliceville. Franz Becker approached Captain William Harris with a request. Franz spoke careful English, asking permission to hold a proper funeral for Johann, a military funeral with honors. He expected to be refused. Why would the Americans allow enemy soldiers to honor their dead with ceremony? But Captain Harris surprised him. The Geneva Convention allowed it, Harris explained. Article 76 specified that prisoners of war who died in captivity must be honorably buried, that graves must be properly maintained. The detaining power must allow fellow prisoners to attend funerals and conduct appropriate ceremonies. It was the law, and America would follow it. Franz stood there, processing this. The Americans were going to let them have a military funeral with honors. Jim Washington couldn't believe it when the announcement came. They were going to let the Germans have a funeral with full military honors. His mind went to stories he'd heard, letters from friends in combat units. Black soldiers dying in Italy and the Pacific, shipped home in unmarked crates or buried in segregated cemeteries with minimal ceremony. He'd heard about black soldiers taking heavy casualties, their bodies treated with less care than supply crates. And now these Germans, these Nazis, were going to get a funeral with honors? The anger rose in Jim, hot and familiar. But there was nothing he could do. Orders were orders. The funeral would happen. His job was to stand guard, maintain security. So that's what he'd do, even if it killed him inside. Even if every moment would be a reminder of how little his country valued people who looked like him. The preparations took 2 days. The German prisoners worked with care and efficiency. They made a coffin from scrap wood, salvaged from crates and pallets, sanded it smooth. Several prisoners who'd been carpenters before the war took charge, measuring and cutting with precision. They carved Johann's name and dates into the lid, the letters deep and clean. They fashioned a cross from wire and wood. They pressed their uniforms, polished their boots, practiced marching and formation. Franz organized everything with military precision. He assigned pallbearers, designated positions, wrote out the order of service. He drew on traditions from the Wehrmacht, from Prussia, from centuries of German military funerals. This would be done properly. Johann Schneider would be buried with dignity befitting a soldier, even if he died in an enemy prison far from home. The day of the funeral was cold and clear, early December in Alabama. The sky was brilliant blue. 6,000 German prisoners stood in perfect formation on the parade ground. The coffin sat on a platform draped with a makeshift German flag. Jim Washington stood guard on the perimeter, rifle on his shoulder, face impassive. Inside he was churning with emotions. Anger, resentment, but also something more complicated. The ceremony began. Franz Becker gave commands in German. The formation snapped to perfect order. 6 prisoners lifted the coffin and carried it slowly toward the cemetery. The entire formation followed in precise steps, boots hitting the ground in unison. The sound echoed across the camp, solemn and martial. American guards lined the route, maintaining security but also witnessing something profound. At the graveside, Franz led the ceremony in German. His voice carried across the silent gathering. He spoke about Johann, about his life and service, about young men dying far from home. He read from a prayer book. The prisoners sang hymns, old German hymns about homeland and heaven. Their voices rose together, 6,000 men singing in harmony, the sound both beautiful and heartbreaking. Some prisoners wept openly. Others stood stone-faced, stoic, containing their grief. Heinrich Müller cried, thinking of his brother buried somewhere in Russia, probably in an unmarked grave. At least Johann would have a marker, some small recognition that he'd existed. Franz maintained his composure, but when they lowered the coffin into the ground, his jaw tightened. Jim Washington watched all of this, and despite his anger, he felt something shift inside him. He recognized the grief, the ritual of honoring the dead. the need for ceremony. He'd seen the same in his own community, funerals at his father's church, the way black people mourned with singing and prayer. These Germans weren't so different in that moment. Grief made everyone human. Private Tommy Lee Jackson stood next to Jim, and he wasn't handling it well. Tommy was 21, from Montgomery, angry at the world. He'd grown up watching his father work himself to death, his mother clean white people's houses for pennies. Watching the Germans receive this dignity while black soldiers were treated like garbage was too much. Tommy gripped his rifle tighter, jaw clenched. Jim put a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "I know," Jim said quietly. "I know, brother." After the funeral, something shifted in the camp. The Germans looked at their black guards differently. They'd witnessed these men standing in formation throughout the ceremony, maintaining professional discipline, allowing the funeral to proceed with honor. These guards could have disrupted it, could have shown contempt. They didn't. They did their duty with quiet dignity. Heinrich Mueller started trying to learn English from Doc Robinson. It began when Heinrich came to the infirmary with a cut on his hand. As Doc cleaned and bandaged it, Heinrich asked in broken English how to say certain words. Doc taught him. It became regular. Heinrich would visit, practice English, talk with Doc when things were quiet. The conversations deepened. They talked about family, home, what happens after the war. Heinrich told Doc about his brother who'd died in Russia, about his mother in Berlin, about the propaganda he'd believed. Doc told Heinrich about growing up in Georgia, about his father's church, about the rules of Jim Crow. They were careful not to get too political, but they were honest. One day Heinrich asked the question bothering him, "Why don't you hate us? We tried to kill Americans. We're your enemy." Doc thought carefully. "You didn't try to kill me specifically," Doc said. "You were following orders, fighting for your country, same as any soldier. Now you're here and the war's somewhere else. No point in hating you for things you can't control." Heinrich pushed further. "How do you not hate your own country? The way they treat you is wrong. I can see that now." Doc smiled sadly. "I do hate it," he admitted. "I hate the injustice, the racism, how limited my life is because of something I can't change. But I also love my country, or what it could be. America has these big ideas, liberty and justice for all, but it doesn't live up to them. Maybe my generation, maybe the next one, will make it better." Franz Becker began to see the deeper contradictions. He was intelligent, educated, well-read. As a prisoner with time to think, he tried to understand the country holding him. America proclaimed liberty and justice for all, had fought a civil war to end slavery, had a constitution speaking of equality, yet it denied basic rights to millions based solely on skin color. But Franz also saw something the propaganda never told him. He saw black men who, despite being treated as less than human, maintained their dignity, who did their duty even when their country didn't do right by them, who showed kindness to enemy prisoners when they themselves received cruelty. That took a strength Franz had never considered, a courage deeper than battlefield bravery. The work details continued. German prisoners left camp every day, guarded mostly by black soldiers. They worked on farms, in lumber mills, on road crews. The labor was hard but not unbearable. And every time they went out, they saw the same impossible reality. They could enter places their black guards could not. Small Alabama towns had signs everywhere, white and colored. Separate facilities, separate treatments, separate worlds. The German prisoners, enemies of America, could use white facilities. Their black guards could not. One hot June day, a work crew was repairing a bridge. The temperature was over 90 degrees, humidity making the air feel like wet cotton. The foreman brought cold drinks for the workers, handing bottles of Coca-Cola to the German prisoners. Tommy Jackson and another black guard stood nearby, sweltering, throats dry. The foreman ignored them completely. One German prisoner, Klaus Weber, noticed. Klaus was 32, from Hamburg, had been a dock worker. He took his Coke, drank half, then walked over to Tommy and offered him the bottle. "Here," Klaus said in broken English. "You need." Tommy stared at the bottle, at this gesture from an enemy soldier. Pride told him to refuse. Thirst told him to accept. He took it, drank, handed it back. "Thank you," Tommy said. Klaus nodded. "Is wrong," Klaus said. "Very wrong." Tommy almost smiled. "Yeah," he agreed. "It is. These small moments happen more often. Individual Germans and black guards finding common ground, recognizing each other's humanity. They weren't friends exactly. The circumstances prevented true friendship, but they developed mutual respect, an acknowledgement that they were all caught in systems bigger than themselves. Doc Robinson continued to be the moral anchor. He treated injuries and illnesses, but also listened. Germans came to him with problems, not just medical, but personal. They trusted him. He never judged, never used confessions against them. When Heinrich told him about his doubts, about questioning everything he'd been taught, Doc didn't lecture. He just listened, told Heinrich that questioning was good, that growth came from doubt. Blackguards also came to Doc about daily humiliations, constant reminders of second-class status. After Tommy was threatened by locals for walking on the wrong side of the street, he came to Doc shaking with rage and fear. Doc let him vent, then spoke quietly about survival, about choosing battles, about the long view. "This won't last forever," Doc said. "Things are changing, slowly, but changing. We just have to outlast the hate." As months passed, more German prisoners died. One in a logging accident, crushed by a falling tree. Another from appendicitis that turned septic. A third from a heart condition, just collapsed during work. Each time the Americans allowed a funeral. Each time Franz organized the ceremony. Each time Jim Washington and the other blackguards stood watch, witnessing dignity afforded to enemies but denied to themselves. The repetition created a strange ritual. The Germans would build a coffin, prepare a ceremony, stand in formation. The guards would provide security. The body would be buried in the small cemetery that grew slowly. It became almost routine, except it never truly did. Each funeral was a reminder, each ceremony a symbol of something larger. Jim started to understand something that hadn't been clear before. The Germans were getting these funerals not because America cared about them specifically, but because the world was watching. The International Red Cross sent inspectors. Swiss diplomats checked conditions. If America mistreated German prisoners, Germany could retaliate against American POWs. International law and mutual interest protected the Germans. But nobody was watching how America treated its black soldiers. No international convention protected them. No diplomats inspected their conditions. They were America's own, and America could treat them however it wanted. The Germans got dignity because they were foreign. Black Americans were denied it because they were home. Understanding this didn't make it easier. The systematic nature of it, the intentionality, that was almost worse than random hatred. This wasn't ignorance. This was policy. This was America choosing every day to deny humanity to millions of its citizens. Jim's fight wasn't just against Germany or Japan. His fight was for something that would continue long after this war ended. Heinrich Muller's worldview continued to crumble. The more he saw, the less sense his Nazi education made. He'd been taught Germans were superior, that racial hierarchy made nations strong. But America, defeating Germany, was racially mixed. The black soldiers guarding him were competent and professional. The kindness shown to prisoners contradicted propaganda about American brutality. He wrote letters home, though he knew they'd be censored. He tried to tell his mother what he was learning, about the complexity he was discovering. He wrote about being treated well, about learning English, about meeting people who challenged his assumptions. He wrote about Doc Robinson without mentioning he was black, just saying there was a medic who showed great kindness. Most letters never arrived, disrupted by war. But Heinrich kept writing, kept processing. Franz Becker developed an unusual relationship with Captain Harris. Harris would walk through the camp, checking conditions, talking to prisoners and guards. He was decent, educated from Boston, had gone to Harvard. He believed in the Constitution, in American ideals, even if he recognized his country's failures. He and Franz would have conversations about war, duty, morality, the future. Harris admitted America's racial policies troubled him. He'd grown up in the North where segregation was less overt but still present. He'd never really thought about it until commanding black soldiers and seeing how they were treated. "It's wrong," Harris told Franz. "I know it's wrong, but I can't fix it. I can just do my job and treat people fairly within my power." Franz respected that honesty. He'd served a regime that never admitted wrong. A country that could admit its failures had hope. The war continued far from Alabama. D-Day came in June of 1944, the invasion of Normandy. News filtered into the camp slowly, censored. The German prisoners knew their country was losing. Italy had surrendered. The Eastern Front was collapsing. The Allies were advancing. Some prisoners felt despair. Others felt relief that the madness might stop. For the blackguards, the war's progression brought mixed feelings. Pride that the Allies were winning, that evil was being defeated, but also the question, what happens after? They'd served, done their duty, proved themselves. Would America recognize that? Would things change? Or would they come home to the same segregation, the same discrimination? They wanted to hope, but history gave little reason for optimism. Tommy Jackson changed over the months. The rage was still there, would always be there. but he learned to channel it, control it. He watched Jim Washington, how Jim maintained dignity without becoming passive. He watched Doc Robinson, how Doc treated everyone with consistent kindness, refusing to let hatred corrupt him. Tommy learned, grew up in ways beyond age. One day Tommy supervised a work detail, and a German prisoner named Dieter asked him a question. "Why do you stay? Why not leave? Go somewhere they treat you better." Tommy thought about it. "This is my country," he said. "My people been here longer than most white folks, built half of it with our labor. We're not leaving. We're going to make it live up to what it claims to be." As 1944 turned to 45, the war's end came into view. Germany was collapsing. Russians approached Berlin from the east, Americans and British from the west. At Camp Aliceville, prisoners listened to controlled news, read censored newspapers, heard rumors. Their country was dying. Their homes were being destroyed. They didn't know if their families were alive. The last months brought strange melancholy to the camp. The Germans knew they'd lost, knew they'd have to reckon with what they'd support. The guards knew they'd soon go home, but didn't know what home would be. Everyone was suspended between an ending and a beginning. In April of 1945, news of President Roosevelt's death reached the camp. The Americans mourned. The Germans watched this morning, seeing genuine grief, seeing a country united in loss across racial lines. At least in that moment, it gave some of them hope that maybe America would fully embrace its ideals. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, VE Day. At Camp Aliceville, the reaction was complex. The Americans celebrated quietly, aware their prisoners were receiving the worst news of their lives. The Germans absorbed defeat with stunned resignation. Some celebrated privately, glad the dying was over. Others sank into depression. The camp maintained order, but the atmosphere was heavy. Jim Washington felt mixed emotions. Pride that evil had been defeated, that the Nazis were finished. But also the immediate question, what now? What would happen to him, to the other black soldiers when they went home? Would anything change? Had their service earned them anything? The prisoners began repatriation slowly, a process taking years. Some Germans stayed in America for a long time, working because there was nothing to go home to yet. Heinrich Müller was among those staying into 1946. He'd changed fundamentally. The boy full of Nazi ideology was gone. In his place was a young man questioning everything, trying to build new understanding based on what he'd witnessed. Before Heinrich left, he found Doc Robinson one last time. They'd become as close to friends as circumstances allowed. In carefully practiced English, Heinrich said, "You taught me what it means to be human, to see people as people. I won't forget." Doc shook his hand firmly. "You did the learning," Doc said. "That's the hard part." Franz Becker was one of the last to leave, departing in spring of 1946. The camp was winding down, most prisoners gone. Franz had used the time to process everything, to think deeply about what he'd experienced. Before leaving, he sought out Jim Washington. They'd never had a real conversation, just necessary exchanges. In careful English, Franz told Jim, "I have seen many soldiers in my years. You are among the best. Not because of how you fight, but because of how you kept your honor when you had every reason to lose it." Jim didn't know how to respond. "Sometimes I wanted to," he admitted. "Wanted to be angry and bitter. Still do some days." Franz nodded. "That you resist that you stay human, that is the greatest victory." The camp closed in summer of 1946. Jim Washington got his discharge papers, returned to Mississippi, tried to figure out what came next. The uniform came off, but experiences stayed with him. He'd learned things at Aliceville that would shape the rest of his life, about dignity, about humanity, about fighting for what's right even when it seemed impossible. Jim became active in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. He organized registered voters, faced down the Klan, got arrested more times than he could count. When people asked why he kept fighting, he told them about Aliceville, about guarding German prisoners who got treated better than him, about showing dignity when dignity was denied. Those years taught him that you could hate injustice without losing yourself to hate. Tommy Jackson also went home, also joined the movement. He was more militant than Jim, angrier, less patient. He pushed for faster change, more direct action. He was there for the Montgomery bus boycott, for the Freedom Rise, for the March from Selma. He got beat up more times than he could count. But he never quit. Aliceville had taught him that endurance was its own form of resistance. Doc Robinson stayed in the Army, served through integration of the military in 1948 when President Truman signed Executive Order 9981. He was there when black and white soldiers finally served together officially. He treated wounds in Korea, in Vietnam. He rose to major, trained younger medics, passed on his philosophy of care without prejudice. He retired in 1968, returned to Georgia, worked in a clinic treating poor people. He never lost his gentle touch. Heinrich Müller went back to destroyed Germany, a country trying to reckon with what it had done. He settled in West Germany, became a teacher, spent his life educating young people about the dangers of hatred and ideology. He taught English, told students about America, about its contradictions and possibilities. He never hid that he'd been a Nazi soldier, that he'd believed terrible things. He used his journey as a lesson, showing that people could change. Franz Becker returned to Prussia, which was no longer part of Germany, but divided between Poland and the Soviet Union. His family estate was gone. He moved to Berlin, became a city planner, helped rebuild the destroyed city. He raised his children to question authority, to think critically, to recognize humanity in all people. When he died in 1975, his son found his journals, detailed accounts of his time in the camp, his observations about race and dignity and contradiction. Years later, in 1978, there was a reunion. Someone organized it, brought together former guards and prisoners from Camp Aliceville. Not many came, some were dead. Others couldn't make the trip, but a few dozen men gathered in Alabama at the site of the old camp. Most buildings were gone, reclaimed by red clay and pine trees, but the cemetery remained, maintained by local historical societies. Jim Washington came, now in his 60s, gray-haired but still strong. Tommy Jackson was there, moving slower but eyes still fierce. Doc Robinson came, retired but still carrying that gentle presence. Heinrich Müller came from Germany, nervous about returning, unsure of his welcome. Franz Becker had died, but his son came, wanting to understand his father's stories. They walked the grounds together, these old men who'd once been young. They stood at the cemetery, looked at names carved on wooden markers. Someone had placed fresh flowers on every grave. The care moved them deeply. Tommy stood beside Jim, both men silent. "You ever regret it?" Tommy asked. "Showing them that kindness when we got treated like dirt?" Jim thought carefully. "No," he said. "World had enough hate then. Still does now. Didn't need me adding to it. We showed them what we're really made of. That matters." Heinrich approached them, introduced himself, thanked them for allowing the reunion. His English was much better now. He told them what their example had meant, how it changed his life, how he'd spent decades trying to be worthy of the humanity they'd shown him. Jim shook his hand, saw the sincerity in his eyes. "You learned well," Jim said. "Now teach others. That's how it spreads." They talked for hours, former enemies, former guards, and guarded. They shared stories about their lives, their children and grandchildren, their hopes and disappointments. They talked about changes they'd seen, how America had slowly addressed racial injustices, how Germany had confronted its past. The progress was real, but incomplete, ongoing, requiring constant effort. Franz's son told them about his father's journals, how highly the elder Franz had spoken of the Black Guards, how their dignity challenged everything he thought he knew. He'd brought some journals, read passages aloud. The men listened, some moved to tears, hearing how they'd been seen, how their quiet resistance had mattered. As the sun set, they gathered one more time at the cemetery. Someone suggested they hold a ceremony, honor all the dead. They stood in a circle around the graves. Doc Robinson said a prayer his father had taught him, about rest and peace and reconciliation. Heinrich recited the German hymn they'd sung at funerals, his voice cracking. Jim spoke about dignity, about humanity, about the long fight for justice that connected them all. They stood together as last light faded, former enemies, just men now, old men who'd lived through something that shaped them. They'd been young once, caught in a war, thrown together by circumstances beyond control. They could have let it make them bitter, could have embraced hatred. Some did. But these men chose differently. They chose to see each other, to recognize shared humanity, to carry forward lessons about dignity and resistance and hope. The story of Camp Aliceville reveals something essential about World War II, often forgotten. The war wasn't just fought on distant battlefields. It was fought in small southern towns, in prison camps, in the hearts of men trying to reconcile duty with dignity. It was fought by black soldiers who served a country that didn't fully accept them, who guarded enemy soldiers receiving better treatment. It was fought by German prisoners who had worldviews shattered, who learned propaganda had lied, who discovered humanity in unexpected places. The funerals were perfect symbols, representing both America's best impulses and worst failures. Following international law, treating prisoners humanely, allowing dignity even to enemies, those were America's best qualities. but denying that same dignity to black citizens, maintaining brutal segregation, upholding racist laws, those were America's deepest failures. The contradiction was stark, unavoidable, documented in every ceremony where Germans were honored, while black Americans were degraded. But the story doesn't end with contradiction. It ends with the men who lived through it, who learned from it, who carried those lessons forward. Jim Washington, Doc Robinson, Tommy Jackson came home and fought for change. They marched, organized, told their story. They used the irony of their experience as a weapon against injustice. They said, if German prisoners deserved dignity, then surely black Americans deserved no less. And men like Heinrich Müller and Franz Becker went home and rebuilt Germany on different principles. They rejected the hatred they'd been taught. They raised children who learned different values. They built a country that faced its crimes, that reckoned with its past, that tried to be better. That transformation started in places like Camp Aliceville, in moments of recognition, in funerals that showed young Germans the world was more complicated and more human than propaganda allowed. The camp is gone now. Barracks torn down decades ago, barbed wire removed, guard towers collapsed. But the cemetery remains, carefully maintained. The German graves are still there, marked and tended. And now there are also markers for the black soldiers who served, plaques that tell their story, monuments that honor their sacrifice and dignity. If you visit today, you can stand where Jim Washington stood, where Franz organized funerals, where Doc showed kindness, where Tommy learned to channel rage into resistance. You can see graves of German prisoners who couldn't believe they were allowed to honor their dead. You can feel the weight of that contradiction, dignity for some and denial for others. And you can understand something essential about America, about how far we've come and how far we still have to go. The story of Camp Aliceville is the story of America itself, contradictory, complicated, filled with both noble ideals and shameful failures, but always with the possibility of being better, of learning, of growing. The men who lived through those years showed that change is possible, that humanity can triumph over hatred, that dignity can persist even in systems designed to crush it. That's the real legacy of those strange years, those impossible funerals, that moment when enemy soldiers couldn't believe. Americans let them hold ceremonies with full military honors while denying those same honors to their own black citizens. Subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history. Hit that like button if this story moved you, and leave a comment below. What do you think about the treatment of German POWs compared to black American soldiers during World War II? How do you think this history should inform our present? Let's keep this important conversation going. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.